So my name's Karen Massey, and I have the honor of being the president of the board of the Ozark Land Trust right now. Currently, we protect a little over 32,000 acres in the Ozarks bioregion.
I'm Greg Galbraith. I was the founder of Ozark Regional Land Trust. It was started in 1984 to work with people around the Ozarks who were interested in holding land for environmental protection.
So the Ozark Land Trust has a variety of methods that we employ to help preserve lands. And it really depends on the situation involved. So we have conservation easements. We actually have preserves where we own the land. And we work with landowners to implement practices to preserve the natural resources or the conservation values of the property. So I grew up in the Ozarks, in Ozark, Missouri itself. And my whole childhood was all about playing in the rivers, playing in the streams, swimming, being out in the hills. We played and swam in Bull Creek and Bear Creek, hung out at Table Rock Lake. So when I think about the Ozarks, that's what I think about. It's home. It's the hills, it's the rivers, it's the views. And it's amazing the development and the economic development and really some good things that are happening here in the Ozarks. But we need to preserve what's so special about the Ozarks, and that is those beautiful natural lands and our clear streams and creeks.
Well, I grew up in the Ozarks, and also it was a regular thing to go floating and swimming and spending time on the creeks. Nature was all around me. Small town, Carthage, Missouri. Grew up with loving the land and the Ozarks. As I grew older, I was interested in the ecological side of protecting land and concerned about the misuse, the development. When I moved back to Missouri from the East Coast, I had been gone for about 10 years, and things had changed. And one of the things is that there was a back to the land movement. I discovered an organization called Ozark Area Community Congress, OAK as it's known. And I went there, found a vigorous group of people who were interested in bioregionalism. And what that meant is how you relate to the land, how you live with the land, and and encompasses a huge amount of things. That's where I met and discovered there was a whole community of back to landers who were interested in alternative energy, community, education, self-sufficiency, environmental issues, and many things like that. People had heard of land trusts, of which I knew quite a bit about from living on the East Coast where there are more land trusts. But there was nobody there that knew how to do a community land trust. One person in particular, Ella Alford, wanted to initiate community land trusts in Missouri. She had a piece of land called Hawk Hill. She brought Bob Swan, who was head of the E.F. Schumacher Society. He spent his whole life studying economic systems, from the Schumacher point of view of small is beautiful. We got together and figured out a way to get Hawk Hill started as a community land trust that would be open for people to have long-term leases, build their houses, utilize the property, and protect a large part of it. So Bob came up with an idea of having a 501c3 nonprofit organization that would be the parent organization and having a 501c2 title holding company to be the holder of the land and to lease it out. And that fits within the categories that the IRS allows. When he presented that to Oak, me, and Ella, that said, okay, that's great. That's what we could do. My thinking was, this is a lot of work, to set up one project. And I think it needs to be a region-wide thing. We envisioned that the land trust that was going to be formed would not be the same entity that put together Hawk Hill. That would become an affiliate organization. And Ozark Regional Land Trust would become an umbrella organization that could be doing spawning projects across the Ozarks. What made me think that? Well, there's all these people at Oak that were looking at the bioregion as their focus because a land entity in itself, which with characteristics that are unique to it, separate from other lands around it. So that's what the bioregional thing is. So we identified Ozark Regional Land Trust with the whole bioregion. Ella was instrumental. She donated the land. She basically instigated the beginning of Ozark Regional Land Trust with the help of Bob Swan. And I was essentially ended up being the organizer. That's how ORLT got started.
So what did you think? What was your ultimate vision? When you conquered the world, what did it look like?
Well, I would say it was a leap into the unknown because there was a lot of enthusiasm. There was no particular money, to work with. So it was totally grassroots. But there was a huge amount of interest among people. And, that just propelled itself. And for a number of years, a good 8 years, we were doing projects. But every single landowner that we worked with would say, how are we going to know you're going to be here in 20 years? Because we're talking perpetuity, which is a little longer than I even know what that is. But landowners took the same leap of faith that we did.
So what kind of projects did you do?
The trending practice, the most popular thing that Ozark Regional Land Trust does today is conservation easements. Well, at that time, conservation easements were not an option because people didn't know what they were. I did not know much about them either, and the tax laws, they'd just been developed in 1986. So when people wanted to protect land, the options were basically that the land trust would own the land, or it was a partnership where we had an agreement of some sort to protect. A community land trust was one of those options. So in the really the first 10 years of Ozark Regional Land Trust, we did a lot of projects, but they were all geared towards us owning the land. New Pear Farm, Nine Stone, which was a community land trust. Sweetwater was community land trust. Hawk Hill Community Land Trust. And then preserves like Circoxie, Woods Prairie, and many, many more. What I found was that people were coming to us from everywhere wanting to protect land. That's never stopped from the first year until today. Eventually, that led to all kinds of projects into conservation easements and mitigation work and large-scale working forests. Our first conservation easement began in 1995. It was called Tall Pines. And actually there was a trend across the country with nonprofit organizations, largely in cooperation with a Land Trust Alliance that was guiding organizations to do conservation easements and setting standards for it.
The conservation easements are really interesting because those are when landowners are interested. They've made a decision as a family that they're going to come to us and say, help us protect this land for generations to come. So we actually put an easement on the property so the property can't be developed, and certain things have to be done to preserve the conservation values of that easement. And these can be on working farms, they can be timberland, they can be prairie. So it's really neat to see families that have made this decision. This is what's right for us, so we can preserve it for our future generations or other folks in the Ozarks to enjoy.
So we started the organization with more inspiration and moral support and very little financial support. But it really didn't take a lot of money to get things going. I was the executive director. I wasn't paid. I supported myself in other ways. I was happy, even though it was a huge amount of work that I did in my spare time. I was having fun doing what we were doing. It's a total delight what the Land Trust does and working with landowners and land. Anybody would give their right arm to have that job. The paperwork is another thing. But the organization grew so much and so tedious that we decided it was absolutely necessary to transition to a paid executive director. Actually, I continued to be executive director for 25 years. We had some paid staff from the late 90s to support the work we were doing because it grew and grew. We were basically protecting thousands of acres of land. By the time I left, I believe it was probably 18,000 acres.
So did Ted Heisel become the first executive director after you?
He did.
Yeah.
He was the first full-time executive director. He took my place.
And then Dave Coonrod was there for a little bit, and then Peggy Horner. And she was the executive director when I came on the board. And then we hired, my first meeting is right the time when we hired Larry Levin as the executive director. One thing that Peggy really worked on was accreditation. So we worked with Land Trust Alliance, a national organization, and they looked into our policies, our practices, all of our records. Were we doing things right? And could we be counted on to be there in perpetuity, forever, to take care of these properties and make sure that they, maintained, protected. And so that was really a big deal when they got that first accreditation. And we were the first ones in Missouri, which was really exciting. A nice next step is how can we work with different partners, whether they be land trusts or state or federal agencies. But the fact that we can do so much more if we work with other partners. Everybody brings their own strength. So that's been one really cool thing, I think, that's happened a little more recently.
Yeah, there's an evolution from, we're still working with landowners who contact us all the time, but our ability to accomplish more things comes from relationships with government agencies. But we still are ourselves. I know back in my day, we didn't have a lot of resources or money. We also didn't get a whole lot of respect from government agencies. We were kind of like fringe to them. That began to change sometime while I was still executive director later on, that we started building relationships with soil conservation and
And
doing
NRCS and
partnerships that were very landowner oriented. And also with Fish and Wildlife, who needed partners to do a number of projects. So over time, we've had gained the respect of everybody. Wouldn't you say?
I would. And I think about the work in the Huzzah. They had been working with their soil and water conservation folks and their conservation folks for years. And we had staff, Abigail was going in and working with them, trying to get the first easements. And finally, we got that one family that came in and said, yeah, we want to protect this land. It was like once we got that first easement in that area, the farmers then, they started looking at us a little bit differently too. It's like, this may work. And we just keep getting more and more parcels that get protected. And then more and more conservation practices are happening. So I think it's really starting to make a difference in the Huzzah area in particular. One of the really interesting things that we're doing is with Alfred Forest, and it's a couple thousand acres of land, forest in Ozark County. And there, not only is that land preserved, but we've sold the carbon credits. It's kind of a twofer. Not only have we protected this land, but we're also getting a source of revenue then. And we use that revenue, we turn around and use it to help preserve and protect that land even further, to do good conservation practices, forest management practices. So how did you think, as you were getting ready to step back a little bit from the day-to-day operations?
My last year as executive director was around 2008, and money was tight. We were going to make a transition. One thing I wanted to do was get an operation endowment started. And so we made a big leap of faith and raised over $100,000 to start the first operating endowment. And it's been built on continually.
So that's what the Promise for the Future campaign is all about. We're really looking at getting donations that will set us up that we can use for our operations, so that money is there for when things are really tight. We saw what happened during COVID. I mean, everything changed. So if a big game changer like that happens in the future, something that disrupts everything, we need to be able to pay our staff. For the first time, we've got almost 10 staff members now. It'll also allow us to have a greater impact. We've got the operational money there, so we can keep going out and meeting with new landowners for potential projects, that we can keep looking at more practices, working with different partners. It really sets that foundation. I think one of the things that Ozark Land Trust needs to think about and be very strategic is, what properties are we going to protect? There are so many amazing places in the Ozarks, but we only have a limited amount of resources. And so part of this is partnerships. Certain partners may protect other properties, but it's really looking at what are those conservation values that make a property really special. Are they priority watersheds? Are they springs? Is it an endangered species? What geological features are really special about properties? One of the things we look at in lands is, when we're protecting them, is there other protected lands in the area? That makes a property more valuable, because the more property in an area you can protect, the more connectivity you have for species to go from property to property, to have flyways, to have places where birds can get into. And we're seeing a lot of changes. The climate's changing, and we're seeing impacts on many species now. So that's one of the things I think is really cool. The more properties we can protect, the more beneficial habitat we're providing, and other benefits. What do you think about climate and how that works with the Land Trust?
There is going to be a matter of strategy here to preserve as much of what we have, but climate is going to create changes that we cannot reverse. Different species are going to be favored. There's going to be a migration of species that were not here so much. It's going to be a challenge. It's a big challenge. It's going to be gradual, but the impacts are unavoidable.
The other thing I think about is moving into the future is, who's next? We've got Greg, who started us. We're trying to carry the banner here, but who's behind us? And I think really thinking about the younger generations and how to bring them and get them excited about nature. And that's a lot of our partnership work as well. Some folks do that better than we do, and we need to work with them so we can bring them into our fold, so they can understand why it's so important to protect some of these lands.